be a good one tonight. We've got Jules Wagner, who's joining us, and Kirstin Swartz. Both
One note. Sorry, Dafydd, go ahead.
Both from the Saratoga store.
One note for those of you who are new to these events, we do record these to post on YouTube in the future with some light editing. However, if your camera's on, you don't need to be worried. You will not be recorded unless you unmute and talk into your microphone. So as long as you stay muted, you are not part of the recording. You don't have to be. If you want to ask a question later or comment or recommend books of your own, you can do that in the chat function, and Dafydd and I will read that out for you. Or if you want to ask something on camera or talk on camera for a minute later on when we get to time for audience participation, just let us know, myself or Dafydd, in the chat, and we will unmute you when the time comes. So that is all of the logistics. And we talked about this a minute ago amongst ourselves, and I completely forgot which of us we decided was going first. It was
I'm going first.
Okay, so we are going to turn things over to Dafydd to tell you about some great books that he's been reading lately.
Okay, I've been reading. Reading has been weird for me during this pandemic. But at a previous Bookseller Book Chat, I mentioned that I had started reading the first book I want to talk about. I only have two prompts today, unfortunately, but that's Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, which has gotten a lot of press. Mike Hare recommended it on a Bookseller Book Chat once before as well. It's really a powerful book, and then we also hosted Dwight Garner, who gave it a wonderful review in the New York Times. And then when we hosted him as well on an event, we again talked about how powerful the book is. Wilkerson, she is known for her previous book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the Great Migration. But Cast, the sort of the thesis of the book is that America has a caste system just like India did, except it's on lines of racial lines. And so throughout the book, she compares sort of American Jim Crow laws and before and afterwards to the Indian caste system, opening with a wonderful passage in which when Dr. King went to India, he was welcomed as an American untouchable, a Dalit. And at first he said that this really bothered him, but then he recognized that it really was true. And so Wilkerson is sort of animated by this, but then the other thing she compares all at the same time is to Nazi Germany. And there's a terrifying chapter that taught me a lot about when the Germans, the Third Reich was making its racial laws, they based them on the Jim Crow South laws. And in fact, this terrifying moment where these Nazi generals were saying they couldn't possibly believe that these laws were enacted, that they were so bad, and they counseled to be a little kinder than the American laws that were on the books. Anyway, very powerful book. A lot of people have been talking about it. I would, on the rec card I wrote yesterday, I said I wish every American would read it. The last 30 pages or so are also very powerful, in which she looks at ways sort of to personally move away from racism through interaction. And finally, I think the book also really answers the question that's always bothered me, which is why do people vote against their economic self-interests? And it seems she offers the answer, it's racism. Powerful book. I can't recommend it enough. Let me see, for instance, the last chapter is called The Heart is the Last Frontier. It's structured around with little pieces of story. It's not just a demeaning, changing read, it's enraging, but the way she puts the narrative together with anecdotes from real people, from novels, from history, it makes it really, really gripping. The next book I wanted to recommend, I don't have a copy of this one, it's Alex Ross's Wagnerism. It's an 800-page beast of a book that is about the influence of Richard Wagner, who he really makes the case is the greatest 19th century artistic figures, or the most important one. And so it's a history of his influence on everything that happened afterwards, except music, because then it would be an impossibly long book. And each chapter is likewise structured in strange views, sort of the Black Wagner. W.E.B. Du Bois was a huge Wagnerian and attended the opera performances. There's the gay Wagner, which is a strange story of how Wagner's King Ludwig II, who was sort of an early LGBT icon, and his relationship with Wagner. Nietzsche was, of course, Wagner's first acolyte, and there's a long passage about that. Likewise, I don't even really care that much for Wagner's operas. I would much rather go with Puccini myself. I'm more of an Italian fan, or French. But there's, even if I'm like forgetting exactly what happens in, the second or third section of The Ring, the massive, huge opera, the days-long one, Ross has a great way of sort of fitting in and telling all the stories in an accessible way, even if you might remember them. And so he marches through all these things, but really at the heart of the book is Wagner's influence on Hitler and the Third Reich and anti-Semitism. And Wagner himself wrote a number of anti-Semitic pamphlets that then embraced sort of in later life. And so it's really becomes this great study of sort of art and politics and how these things sort of coexist. And there was a recent review of it in the New York Review of Books that said he kind of discounts Wagner or he rejects him, and I don't think that's the case. Rather, he really tries to grapple with, what happens with sort of the heredity of art and what happens after it and sort of influence on other things. The next book I want to recommend, it's a novel that just came out in paperback by Dexter Palmer called Mary Toft, or The Rabbit Queen. It's a historical novel set in the 18th century England based on a historical incident in which a woman on the outskirts of London and sort of the countryside started giving birth to rabbits. And this, of course, was a hoax, but it's a fascinating novel. It's a great sort of picture of the 18th century in all of its dirtiness. So it takes what's essentially the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment and shows a really focuses the microscope on what's irrational about it. This hoax that's performed essentially for attention that just runs out of control with all these rabbit parts. It's an unpleasant book. It's a hard book to get through, but it really is one of the most memorable novels I've read in a long time. And it's the picture of the 18th century is really spot on. And it's this picture of 18th century medicine, and the characters move into London, and you really get a sense of how dirty and disgusting cities were 300 years ago. Highly recommended. The paperback just came out yesterday. Likewise, got two more books to recommend, both poetry. The last one is another author we had for an event. That's Rachel Eliza Griffiths. She is a Yaddo alum, and we hosted her for her book of poetry, Seeing the Body. It's an amazing volume inspired by, unfortunately, the death of her mother. And it's all about grief, these very, very powerful poems. But she connects it with, she also fills it with a number of photographs she made, all self-portraits of herself, taken at different times, a lot of them around the Saratoga Springs area. For instance, there's one poem that she read, and I would strongly recommend any of you to look up. And she told us when we were hosting her that it was recently put in the Best American Poetry volume for the year, a poem that's almost unbearably painful called Good Mother, in which I'm doing it no justice by the heresy of paraphrase, but it's an amazing poem which she, after the death of her mother, she's in the grocery store in a CVS, and she realizes it's Mother's Day, and she feels sort of the kindness of a stranger. It's just a killer. And anyway, it's a beautiful book and full of great poems. And the last book I'd like to recommend, it's the new translation of Beowulf by Maria Davana Headley. This is it's the most pleasure I've ever received from reading Beowulf. I've read it a few times in a few different translations. And at first I was worried the first word is bro. And that is actually a fair enough translation for the word that we don't really even know what it means. In a wonderful introduction, she sets up what she's trying to do. And she's clearly got the chops. She's clearly studied Anglo-Saxon very carefully, and she looks at these moments that were later translated. For instance, Grindel's mother avenges her son's death. All the translations always talk about her being beastly, but she looks carefully at the word, and she sees that rather the word that's been conveyed as a monster, hag, or something like that, is really just a feminine version of the word hero. So she's out avenging her son's death, which is right in keeping with all of the other epics of the time, which is all about blood feuds up there and the Dark Ages. Really, really fascinating translation, and she keeps the elements that are really poetic about Beowulf too. The heavy alliteration in the poetry, likewise the kinnings, which are the little Anglo-Saxon adjectives, basically, which instead of like a word for sea, the word would be whale road. So it sounds really, really, really good. So I highly recommend it. It's even like the slow parts of Beowulf that are kind of highly culturally specific, like the importance of a name. She kind of charges that with what's important to the culture about it. It makes it kind of, even the slower passages, kind of exciting. So anyway, those are my books. Thanks very much for listening. Next up is Kirstin Swartz.
Hello, hi everybody. So I have a couple of recommendations. I tried to keep a spooky theme just because it's spooky season. Halloween's my favorite time of year. But there's a couple that are just like simple stories as well. But I'm going to start out with my most spooky recommendation, which is The Chestnut Man. That is by Søren Svedstrup, which I hope I pronounced correctly. He's a writer and TV show producer from Denmark. And if you ever heard of a show called The Killing that was on AMC and then Netflix, he was the creator of that. This is his first delving into writing a novel, which I hope will also become a series. And it is set in his hometown in Copenhagen, Denmark. And it is about the serial killer who he starts murdering women, young women who are, maybe morally ambiguous women, and amputates their hands, their arms, their legs. So like each victim of his has a limb or a part of their body missing, and he leaves a small made chestnut man, like a little man made of chestnuts at each crime scene. And he just is going on this killing spree in Copenhagen, and it's left up to these two detectives. One is a single mother who is getting a little tired of constantly dealing with murder and major crimes. And then the other is a former Europol agent who kind of doesn't have the motivation for work, and they pair really well together, and they try to figure out who this person is and how to stop it. And it's part crime procedural, part thriller, totally noir. I think if you like noir, this is a great modern noir story, Nordic noir, really. It's also going to become a Netflix series. And then again, I hope that there's a sequel book-wise to this too, because I really enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down when I first read it last year when it came out in hardcover. It is now out in paperback if you're more of a softcover fan. So I highly recommend, but if you are faint-hearted, if you don't like written graphic content, then this might not be your pick, because there are some scenes that are bleh, but that's what a good thriller is all about, in my opinion. So I had a customer tell me that I'm a dark soul, and he thought this was actually supposed to be a much lighter story, and he was pleasantly surprised. So yeah, so that's my darkest recommendation. My next recommendation is a very new book, actually. It just came out yesterday, and it's Lisa Jewell's new book, Invisible Girl. Some of you may know some of Lisa Jewell's previous books. She's most known for Then She Was Gone, and then her most recent book before this one was The Family Upstairs, which I also really enjoyed. And Invisible Girl is set in London, where Lisa Jewell's from, and it revolves around this 17-year-old named Sapphire, and she has gone missing. And the police start questioning kind of like the people that were around in her life, such as her therapist, and this family that she is like become obsessed with, and then that family's creepy neighbor becomes the top suspect because he, you know, he's just a creepy guy, and he might have been one of the last people to see her before her disappearance. So it is kind of like a whodunit, kind of a mystery, but the main theme of this story that I really took from it, and I thought made it very good, was the theme that the people who don't fit the social norm aren't always the ones guilty or the ones that are wrong or bad people. It's usually the ones who can fit to the social norm to the T that can fool everybody around them and still be able to do horrible things. Those are the true monsters in society. So I really enjoyed how she depicted that, because it's a very modern issue right now. And yeah, it was so good. I just flipped right through it. So highly recommend that one. My next recommendation is another thriller. It's called When No One Is Watching, and that is by Alyssa Cole. And that was very, very good. This was kind of like a slow hit. Like, it was out for a little bit, and then out of nowhere, every bookstore, every reviewer was talking about it. It was a bestseller for a bit. I think it's still a bestseller right now. And I was obsessed with it. A lot of early reviews compared this story to Jordan Peele's film Get Out, and I totally saw the comparison. This book is about a Brooklyn neighborhood called Gifford Place that's being slowly overturned by gentrification, which is a very real issue in New York City right now. And this young African-American woman, Sydney, is trying to keep her mother's home from being taken over by this neighborhood. She's trying to protect it from being sold and trying not to be swayed by any money offers or anything like that. And she's upset that her neighborhood's Black history is getting basically run over with white history, and then white gentrification, and all these beautiful brownstone homes with rich history are being turned into condos. So she turns that frustration over into trying to create a walking tour of the African-American history of that neighborhood. So, and she gets help from her new white neighbor, Theo, who is a troubled man in his own ways. And they're both the narrators of this story. And as they learn about the history of this neighborhood, they also learn about a lot of stuff about why this gentrification is happening so fast, and why many of her neighbors are not just selling their homes, but mysteriously disappearing and being arrested and put in jail for crimes they did not commit. So I think why this was compared to Get Out so much is because both this author Alyssa Cole and director Jordan Peele took very real issues that are actually happening and just highlighted them with horror, with the horror genre. And that's why I think this got across to me so well. This book goes over a lot of real things that are happening with gentrification and redlining real estating. If you want to learn more about how those things do affect racism in this country, I highly recommend you read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. There's a whole chapter that she goes over like how redlining and gentrification is directly connected to races and racism. So I thought it was very, very good. Really, really enjoyed it. My next book I'm going to recommend is a book that I just finished today and cried finishing. It's called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This is also a brand new book, and this is by V.E. Schwab. If anyone here is fantasy readers, she is most known for a series that she's had in fantasy for a while, but in a lot of interviews, she's been saying that this is her baby. This is the story that she's been working on and caring for and nurturing, and now it's its own standalone sci-fi fantasy series. I do think that if she wasn't a well-known fantasy author, this probably would have just been put in fiction, because it is kind of that balance of a beautiful fiction story with fantasy elements. But it was very, very good. And it revolves around this young woman named Adeline LaRue, who is from France. And in the year 1714, she was being forced to be married off married off to this older gentleman. And she didn't want to live that life. She was very free-spirited. She wanted to live outside of her village, outside of the small-mindedness of that village. So she pleaded out to any god that would listen to her to help her get out of this. And this entity, he's not really the devil. he's not really like any type of God. He's just this darkness that she ends up calling him Luke. He answers and he makes a deal with her that she'll live forever and she won't age, she won't be harmed, she can heal from any wound, she cannot die, but no one is ever going to remember her. So any interactions she has with somebody, she can have them keep remembering her if they stay in the same shared space for that whole period of time. But if they walk out of the room and then come back in, they're going to forget her. And she spends 300 years traveling the world from all over Europe to the US, trying to find ways to leave her mark through art and music, and finding a way to leave impressions on artists and musicians, so that at least some part of her is left behind throughout history. And then we find her in 2014 in New York City, still trying to do that with New York City artists, when she happens to come across a small bookstore in Brooklyn, and a bookstore worker happens to remember her, and she tries to figure out why, and he has his own stuff going on. His name is Henry, and it becomes a beautiful love story, but also a beautiful story that's like kind of a love letter to art and the impact that art has, and the hunger that many people feel in the world to leave their mark in history. Definitely tear-worthy, but an absolutely necessary story, and not a lot of books make me feel as emotional as this book did. So I think if you're ready for a fantasy book that will make you cry, this is the one. Yeah. So my last book I'm going to recommend is a nonfiction pick. It's technically a gender book. I do think, though, that if anyone here read Untamed by Glennon Doyle earlier this year, which I did, and I absolutely loved that book, you will love this book too. And this is Cassandra Speaks, and that is by Elizabeth Lesser. And this is slightly new. I think it's only a couple weeks old. And Elizabeth Lesser, she goes over the hundreds of stories that have been told about women for probably since the beginning of the written language, from Adam and Eve to Pandora's Box to Greek mythology to the Old Testament. She analyzes all these stories very briefly and very easy to follow type of style, and wakes you up to realizing, oh, all these stories about women are written by men, and they depict women in a very specific format that was able to shape the very specific male entitlement that we have in the world today. And I liked that she was very aware that, you know, there's multiple genders right now. You can't really tie down that misogyny to, like, you know, just the male entitlement. It's really a misogyny against women. And she talks about how all these stories kind of depicted women as like sinful little devils that need to be controlled or tamed and need to be obedient, and that's not the case. But that's how these views that still exist thousands of years later have been passed on, because they get passed on through stories. There's a specific chapter where she's going through a lot of old classic literature in her family basement, and she comes across books like The Art of War and a couple other like philosophy books and self-help books from the ages. And she's like, these are all like basically great philosophy books that also tell us that women need to be controlled, and women can't, you know, handle themselves, and they can't take leadership and all that good stuff. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting without it being too academical. And it kind of has a little bit of her life in it too, and things that she's had to deal with as a woman, as somebody who tries to speak on diversity and equality for every gender. So I absolutely loved it. And I think that if you're a fan of, you know, mythology and storytelling and wanting to see a different take and wanting to understand that very specific male entitlement that is still going on today and very relevant to 2020, then this might be a good book for you. So yeah, those are my recommendations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kirstin. Before we move to our next bookseller, I just wanted to very quickly say that a lot of people have been asking recently basically how to support bookstores and other independent book businesses right now. And one thing that a lot of independent businesses are asking is for people to shop early this year. If you can, get your holiday shopping done as early as possible. It helps to avoid supply chain issues and crowding and all sorts of things. So that is something to keep in mind. And something that Dafydd and I would love to know from all of you is if there are other ideas for online events like this one that we could be doing to help you, find book recommendations, find ideas for what you might need. If you're not wanting to spend time in the store talking to a bookseller, getting personalized recommendations. One idea that we had was to have some bookseller office hours where one or the other of us or some other booksellers would sign on just on a Zoom meeting, and people can dial in and ask for suggestions. But please feel free to email us, events@northshire.com, if there are ways that we can help you to find the book recommendations you need to make your holidays happy. So just putting that out there, let us know your ideas and how we can help. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to a quite new bookseller for the Northshire. They started just before the pandemic hit. So Jules has been with us for less than a year. And I'm going to turn things over to Jules Wagner with some great suggestions.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. So obviously, as you know, I'm new, and this is my first book chat. So I guess let's get started. So the first one that I'm going to be talking about here is called Group: How One Therapist and a Circle of Strangers Saved My Life by Kirstin Tate. And it is coming out later this month. I can't remember if it's coming out October 20th or 27th. Its publishing date got pushed back a little bit, like many other things, because of the pandemic. So, but it is a nonfiction biography about Kirstin, and back in I think the early 2000s, she had just gotten over this eating disorder that she had been dealing with, and now she was starting to suddenly have thoughts of suicide, and she was wondering what is wrong with me? Why am I thinking like this? I should be getting better. And so she went to see a therapist as a last ditch effort, who assigned her to group therapy, in the group therapy, they had one rule, and that rule was no secrets whatsoever. So everything about these people's lives were laid out in front of this group of 7 to 9 other at first strangers. And she was definitely very wary of it all, and she, through the book, had a lot of doubts about if the therapy was truly working for her, and why she wasn't able to find the happiness that she was looking for, even though she went through years of therapy. But towards the end of the book, she does find her happiness, and I won't spoil how she finds it, but she does find it. And really, the book was just, I felt I could relate to many aspects of what she was looking for out of life, and just who she wanted to be, and why she involved herself more into work than into anything else in her life that she wanted, because all she knew was work, to just kind of avoid what she was avoid the feelings that she was having over not finding what she was looking for. So, and I just was always wondering how this book was going to end, because there are not many books that I can't not predict the end of. I can usually predict the ending of how a lot of books will pan out. This one, I could not, though. I could not figure out whatsoever how it would end. Not even a quarter of the way, most of the way through the book. But she talks about how therapy is definitely not a linear line. you will definitely have your ups and downs through it. So you just have to be stubborn enough to keep pushing forward with the process. So obviously, this book is not for the easily disturbed readers because of its mentions of mental health with like anxiety, depression, suicide, eating disorders, cheating, so on and so forth. I definitely did really actually both laugh and cry with this book, and it definitely gave me a lot to think about and helped me fill in some gaps even for my own life as well. And I really think this book could have an impact on society and on people for years to come, because especially with going through a pandemic right now, one of the things that she struggles with in the book is loneliness, and I'm sure with the pandemic a lot of people have been struggling with loneliness as well. So I feel that a lot of people could relate to how she feels about life and about where she's at and so forth. So yeah, so that's Group, like I said, coming out later this month. Definitely look forward to it, and hope that people are able to get their pre-orders in for that. The next book that I'm going to move on to is something that is a little bit older. It came out in 2015, but it is relevant with what the last week of October is for the LGBTQ community. So this book is called The Invisible Orientation: An Introduction to Asexuality, and it's by Julie Sandra Decker. And so the last week of October is Asexuality Awareness Week. And this book just is, I feel like, a very good detailed guide on what asexuality exactly is, because a lot of people don't know what it is, and it's different for everyone that is asexual, really. Because asexuality is a spectrum, and the book goes on to explain the spectrum of asexuality. And it also doesn't just talk about the spectrum of asexuality, it also talks about the spectrum of romantic orientation, because attraction can be split. It's not just one thing. So it talks about that. It talks about gender as well a little bit, but it definitely does mostly cover asexuality and its spectrum and so forth. And it's interesting that I discovered this book in my life when I did. I wish I had discovered it sooner, because asexuality, it makes up 1% of the population. Some people know that, some people don't. And at 17 years old, I realized that I was a part of that 1%. So asexuality as a baseline means you do not experience sexual attraction. So that's what asexuality is. And a lot of people have a lot more questions, I'm sure, about, well, it's not just, how do you just not, and it's like I said, it's a whole thing. So it's all explained very well in that book, and whenever people like have questions that even I don't necessarily have like the words to answer, I'm just like, just go read this. Just go read this. It will explain everything. So yeah, and I feel that it'd just be a very good guide and resource and reference for many people, not just in the community, but outside the community, wanting to support people. So so that's The Invisible Orientation. and support asexuals during the last week of October. Purple, black, gray, and white are the colors of asexuality, and you can wear those colors and just show your support and stuff. So yeah, so now moving on to my next book that I'm going to talk about, which is another nonfiction LGBTQ genders, sexual orientation sort of book. It's called Gender Your Guide, a gender-friendly primer on what to know, what to say, and what to do in the new gender culture by Lee Ayrton. And I talk about this book because just a couple days ago, October 11th, was National Coming Out Day. And obviously on the LGBTQ spectrum is people of many genders, people that are transgender, gender fluid, etc., etc. And I'm sure some of you heard Rachel, when she was referring to me, say they. That is because I go by they, them pronouns. I am transgender. I'm non-binary, and this book just really is a great resource for anyone that doesn't understand gender and that there's more than one, and just like how and why someone could be transgender and so forth. So it's a great, it's also written by someone that's non-binary as well, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So it has like a lot of like ways of how do I refer to this person, and like if they're if you have a non-binary parent, how do you refer to this person? Well, that person is then just your parent. Or I've heard there's also in the books another way of calling a non-binary parent is a Ren. So like, oh hey, that's my Ren, which I thought was very cool that it came up with so many, like I guess like titles to call people that are outside of the gender norms, to just kind of make it a little, I'd really like to see it become a little more mainstream and a little more you know, well known. So I just feel that this book it definitely, it made me feel like I'm not alone in the community. It made me feel like I am more understood than I originally thought I would ever be. So it is a really great book to read up on and search through for some of the answers that many people have about gender, I feel like. So yeah. So that is Gender Your Guide. Definitely another one that I would highly recommend, of course. And so this last book that I am going to talk about, I am almost finished reading. I tried to finish reading it last night, and I literally fell asleep while I was reading it because I was just way past exhausted. And it is also on back order, so it's not available immediately, but place in orders, and well, and you can get them in, or get them as we get them in. This book is a fiction book, so of the four that I'm talking about, this is the only fiction book, and it is a young adult fiction called Cemetery Boys. Cemetery Boys, what can I say about Cemetery Boys? It is just so wonderful. The representation in it of the main character, who is transgender and trying to prove himself to his traditional Latinx family, who one of the other characters in the books refers to them as witches. They are, so Yadriel is the name of the main character. and he and his family have connections with the dead, with spirits, with the afterlife. So the boys in the family can summon ghosts and help them move on to the afterlife, to heaven or whatever. And then the girls in the family can heal the living. So obviously, because Yadriel is transgender and he wants to be like all the other guys in his family and be able to summon ghosts and help them move on to the afterlife, he tries to prove himself to his family because they are not very accepting of him because they are a traditional Latinx family. And they're like, no, you were born a girl, so you can't do that. And so he, in his trying to prove himself to his father and the rest of his family, he ends up summoning a ghost that he now can't get rid of, because the ghost decides to be a pain in the butt and wants to make amends with some things that happened while he was alive, check on his friends, make sure all his friends are okay, and so forth. And so this ghost, whose name is Julian, is also a very interesting character. And I read from the author's Twitter, is canonically has ADHD, and I feel like they present it very well, and show that ADHD cannot just, it's not as big of an issue as a lot of people make it. Like, yes, it is a struggle, but yeah, so, and just the way that Aidan Thomas, who wrote Cemetery Boys, represents Yadriel and talks about Yadriel, it gives me a very warm feeling. It just like, how do I explain it? It represents a transgender boy without breaking character, without really revealing a lot about who he was before he transitioned. So which I felt was very nice. It like very respectful, even of a fictional character. So I'm not quite finished with it yet, but I have already laughed a ton with it. And I am expecting some tears to come towards the end. So yeah, I guess those were my books as well. So I hope you guys really liked the books that I talked about, and I hope that you find enjoyment in them as much as I do, and look forward to Group coming out, and look forward to Cemetery Boys coming back in stock.
Thank you so much, Jules. That's a great list. Lots to dig into there. So I am our last bookseller. I'll try to go quickly so we can leave at least a little bit of time for questions from you guys. First up, I have a book that was actually an event book back in 2017. The author wrote this book largely at Yaddo, and she came and did an event at Northshire when it came out in hardcover. It's now come out in paperback. It was on the New York Times notable list. I'm bringing it up now because, excitingly, it was adapted and filmed in a movie with Frances McDormand that is going to come out at some point. It's been doing the film festival circuit and getting a lot of accolades. So I thought it was a good time for people to revisit it because it's definitely worth reading. The book is Nomadland by Jessica Bruder. It is a work of nonfiction. I pulled it back off of my shelf to read it and refresh myself, and instantly got swept away again by it. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of writing, which is about the subculture of mostly older adults who were displaced by the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, gave up their homes, took to the road in RVs and campers and vans, and started taking seasonal work where they could find it, maintaining campsites, harvesting fruits and vegetables, a lot of them working in Amazon warehouses in various short-term gigs. This is a subculture that's still going on, that's still a very, sort of hidden but real part of American life. The book is gorgeous. It follows multiple of these people through their lives, what brought them there. Many of them formerly middle class who had good jobs and careers, and one or two disasters and or missteps led them to the level of hardship where this is what they decided to do. Some of them had struggled their whole lives. It's not a happy book, obviously, but it's such a true and heartfelt connection to these people. Jessica Bruder came to this as a reporter, as a journalist, and wound up basically joining these people for 3 years of her life. She traveled with them. She took a job herself in an Amazon warehouse. She did all of these different things to experience what that world was like for them. And it's absolutely a gorgeous, wonderful book that you will get swept away in. So this is amazing. I have the hardcover here. It's a paperback now. And I think it's the paperback that Dafydd linked to in the chat. And then other than this, I've been going for extremely escapist reading lately for possibly obvious reasons. So the next things that I have to talk about are overall much happier. The first one is a romance novel called Spoiler Alert. It is delightful. I read it in a day, very happily, avoiding lots of responsibilities that I should have been doing that day. It is a plus-size heroine who writes fan fiction, gets asked out on a date by the star of the show that she writes fan fiction about, basically as a publicity stunt. But unbeknownst to both of them, they have actually been secret online best friends in the fan fiction community for years. And it's just sweet and silly and fun, and made me giggle at multiple points along the way, and a very happy romp if you or anyone you know is looking for something escapist. Next up is a future event book. This author, C.L. Polk, will actually be joining us later on in October for an event. This book just came out on Tuesday. It is amazing. It's The Midnight Bargain. It is fantasy mixed with historical fiction. So it's a magical alternate reality that bears a very strong resemblance to early 1800s England, in that it's an extremely patriarchal society with a courting season where, all the ladies who are eligible have to get dressed up and go to dances and lunches and all of these different society things to get married off. But in this magical system, there is real danger to women when they are pregnant who have magic in them. And so the solution for this is the instant they get married off, they get put into a special collar that takes away their magic for the rest of their lives. Our heroine is young and marriageable and has been shipped off into the marriage mart, and really, really doesn't want any part of that. She wants to keep her magic. She wants to be a sorceress. But she's also met a young man, and he's very delightful, and they really like each other. And so what are they going to do? This was a lot of fun. It was another quick read that was very joyous, and I'm super excited for the event later on this month. So strongly recommend this one for a little bit of fantasy. And then my last pick is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. Amazingly, N.K. Jemisin just got a MacArthur Genius Grant, which is very well deserved for her incredible career as a writer. This is the start of a new trilogy or series. I don't know if it's a trilogy, how many it will be, but it is, the premise is that all great cities are living entities. And when they birth themselves after existing as a city for a certain amount of time, they do so with the help of a living avatar, a human who is both human and the city. And so this is set now, and New York City is finally being born as its true self. But instead of one human avatar, each borough has its own human avatar. So there are people, there's Brooklyn, and there's Manhattan, and there's Staten Island, and there's Queens, and there's the Bronx. And all of them wake up at this moment as themselves, and also much more than themselves. And they have to set out to save the city from the evil forces that seek to destroy it. It's really a remarkable adventure story. It's also a very political commentary on contemporary life. And for anyone with great loving fondness for New York City, who is perhaps not able to be in New York City a lot right now, it's also a very joyous tribute to the city itself. So that is my list. One thing, a book that I have not gotten to yet, but that a lot of my bookseller friends have recommended to me, is actually the book for our event tomorrow night, which is with S.C. Gwynne. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian. And I am completely blanking on the title of the book. It's a Civil War history that our bookseller Mike particularly loved.
Hymns of the Republic. It's called
Hymns of the
Republic. Hymns of the Republic is what it's called.
Right. So that's a Northshire event tomorrow night. And he's going to be interviewed by Joe Donahue. So it's going to be a fun one. So anyone who's interested, come on back for that. And I think we have 8 minutes till we're out of time tonight. So if people have questions, want specific recommendations on specific subjects, or want to make recommendations of their own, you can share those in the chat. You can ask us for permission to unmute. Let us know how we can help you, what books you would like to hear about. I would like to say that the Cemetery Boys is one that I keep hearing over and over and over again about how great it is. And I'm like, I should have bought my copy when we had it in stock. So I missed the boat on that one, at least for now.
I got lucky. I'll say that. I actually hadn't even heard a thing about it until I picked it up.
While everyone is writing us a question, I'd like to mention also that we have tonight at 7, there's a free event. It's a Scholastic family night. It's got some free swag that you basically get if you register for it. Tips on teaching from home, tips on helping students read from home, helping your kids. That's at Scholastic. That's tonight. You can register on Eventbrite. And then again, the S.C. Gwynne tomorrow is going to be very exciting. Is there a message in here?
Yes, there was a question from Buffy asking when the gender book was published, and it looks like the paperback came out in 2019 and the hardcover is from 2018. So not brand new.
And then I just want to say real quick, while we're still waiting for any questions, I think you guys will probably be seeing both bookstores of ours advertise a lot, like shop local, shop early. October is the new December. And we'd really love for you guys to do this or to spread the word, just to shop early, just so, you know, Christmas isn't that crazy. There's a lot of reasons why many bookstores, not just Northshire, is going to be advertising this because of, you know, having to have limited capacity in stores, the fact that the warehouses where we get our books, they're going to have limited staff working and printing and sending these books out. And we have no idea how the rest of the year is going to look regarding like staffing and printing and all that. So the sooner that you can get started on your holiday shopping, the more not only you're going to support the bookstore, but also be prepared for whatever situations we're going to have for the rest of the year. So yeah, you'll be seeing a lot of those little advertisements. Yeah.
And it's really not just us, you know, any small business that you love, you can help them by shopping earlier because, you know, we're lucky in that we have a lot of physical space. So we'll be able to let a fair amount of people into the store at any given time and still maintain social distancing, but some of the other local businesses don't have that luxury. So shopping early really helps everybody if you can. And yes, there was a recommendation from Carol in the chat. She said she's just begun Omar El-Akkad's amazing novel, American War, which has been out for a while, but is very timely. And I've heard great things about that one too. And then Patty suggested having holiday Zooms that are sort of themed to specific genres. So like we have one for science fiction and fantasy, or one for nonfiction, you know, in general, or maybe just history. I think that's a great idea. We're sort of figuring out the schedule because of course the staff will be super busy and harder to tear away, but Dafydd and I may be able to sort of stretch our recommendations and get lists from colleagues and stuff and make it happen. So
right, we'll have the staff, we'll have the holiday staff picks, and we'll all sort of know what's the big books, and I'm going to try to, we're trying to have a good handle on all of the different categories and genres here.
Yeah, themed ones is great. We're also in November going to try to have one of these Zooms with some of our sales reps. So the people who work for the publishers who come around and tell us about the great books. We're going to try to cut ourselves out as the middleman and have them come talk to all of you and tell all of you about some great book ideas. That will be hopefully coming up in November also.
One other note about an upcoming event that might be of interest in a different genre than we normally do is on Monday, we're hosting the American satirist P.J. O'Rourke for his newish book, A Cry from the Far Middle. That one, like S.C. Gwynn, is also going to be in conversation with Joe Donahue. And then there is a question in the chat for Kirstin from Beth. How many books can you read in a month? You read so many. I agree. My question as well.
So, you know, I was reading through a lot during the peak of the pandemic. So I think that actually helped me understand my reading paces and all that. I think one of the reasons why I like mystery so much is that I fly through the books, which is why you see a lot of mystery recommendations from me too. Like this, I finished in a day and a half. Invisible Girl a day, Chestnut Man, which you saw how big that book was. That took me 1 week to do last year. I would say I probably try to read 1 to 3 books a week. And just try to stay on top of it. And I also, you know, I balance between physical books and e-copies of these books that I get granted from NetGalley or from, you know, publishers who send us ebooks as well. So I think that reading between physical books and then like just scrolling through, you know, my phone and reading books from NetGalley and such, that helps me get through it a lot faster and being able to read multiple books at once. But I appreciate that. So thanks for asking about that.
I actually this year for the first time decided that I was going to start tracking my books as I read them. I just started a spreadsheet, and I've been very off my game, and I've read 70 so far this year. So it was, I thought I was going to have this really impressive, great number because like I was finally tracking it. It was going to be great. And then of course this year, like pandemic, and I just was distracted and not reading nearly as much. But it's satisfying to keep track and be like, yes, I am actually finishing things still.
Yeah.
Chrissy Connor says maybe a rec for great audiobooks, and then Denise also said, again, with the idea of good reads in different genres. So I'll try to come up with lists for these different genres in the future, next couple of months, and we'll have some Zoom events in the future, definitely in November and December, that kind of cover all the sections. If there's anything in particular you're interested in, gardening, science, dogs, there's all kinds of sections. Again, just feel free to send us an email at events@northshire.com, and we'd be happy to set all this up.
Yeah, we're going to try to do a lot more of these, you know, in coming weeks and months as time goes on. So we are unfortunately just about out of time, so we need to wrap things up. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It was wonderful to see you. We will have a blog post up at northshire.com tomorrow morning, depending on how quickly Dafydd and I get to our day. Could be closer to noon, but there will be a blog post up in the notes for the notes from the Shire section of the Northshire website which will have links to all of these titles so that you can order them if you missed anything. Thank you everyone for being here. We'll see you again real soon and have a wonderful rest of your evening.